Everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about the evolution slash devolution of the Jesus story. And I guess I'll start with what was written. So, we do have, archaeologists have had, there were biblical scholars who had, hypothesized, I think this was around the 19th century, what they referred to as the Q document was basically a gospel of just things that Jesus said, which possibly predates Paul's letters. I'll give you the date of Paul's letters, or not. And basically it was a gospel of just things Jesus said, or just things he says. And in 1945, archaeologists discovered this huge collection of, like, lost scriptures, and it includes a very high quality papyrus from that time, a gospel where Jesus just says things, one where he's only talking. I mean, no divinity claims. One thing he says that could be thought of as a divinity claim, but that could be debated. Anyway, in either way, included or not, it's sort of the beginning, and it doesn't really add much, but I'll start with the oldest writings outside of that. The letters of Paul. Now, what we refer to as the authentic Pauline letters are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and Romans. And Paul's letters were letters. They were not intended to be looked upon as sacred scriptures. They were not intended to be read in churches 2,000 years later. They were letters written to specific groups of basically Jewish temples. And Christianity wasn't a separate religion, it was sort of a sect of Judaism. And it's implied in the letters that, I mean, he makes references to other groups of these sort of Jewish Christians. And he also mentions encountering Jesus' brother. So, and he himself had never seen Jesus, but he encountered people who had met him. However, anyway, in his letters he refers to Jesus as born of woman, born under the law, and basically talks about him having been destined for divinity, but basically said that it was basically through his death and resurrection where he had been appointed Son of God. Not born Son of God, appointed after dying. And Paul refers to Jesus basically as an ordinary man who became divine after he died. And he talks about there was the man who suffered on the cross, and now he is risen. And so that's the oldest writings, dated from, the earliest was around 47 CE. The last maybe 55, maybe a bit later, 58 CE, maybe later than that. Then let's get to, so basically we have an ordinary man who became divine after dying. And I guess while Jesus was alive, I mean, he was just an ordinary man. So we have an ordinary man who becomes divine after death. Now let's get into the Gospel of Mark, dated to about 70 CE. It begins where he's an ordinary man, but he becomes divine through his baptism. And it includes miracles, but he tells people, keep quiet. don't say anything. And then in the crucifixion narrative, he very heavily suffers, very painfully, and dies on the cross. And then when the women who are close to him visit his tomb, there's an angel that, and there were later Gospels where things were changed, but in the oldest copies we have, which is only the first 8 verses of the final chapter of the Gospel of Mark, basically there's an angel that says, "You won't find him in the tomb, for he is risen. Go out and tell everyone." The tomb closes, the angel leaves, and the women leave, and the final words are, "And they told no one, for they were afraid." So we started out, ordinary man became divine after death. Now we have ordinary man becomes divine through baptism, who then and performs miracles but tells people to keep their mouths shut, suffers very heavily, dies, and basically an angel says that he's risen. Now let's get into the Gospel of Matthew, the next one to be written. Here we add a virgin birth, but it's not that big, it's kind of quick. We basically, he performs miracles, but still tells people to keep quiet about it. And then on the cross he still suffers painfully, dies painfully. And then when his tomb is visited, he reappears in this ghost-like fashion, but I mean, he doesn't walk, no one touches him, he basically says a few things, "I'm with you until the end," and that's how it ends. So now let's the Gospel of Matthew dated to about 80 CE. Now let's get to the Gospel of Luke, dated to maybe 85 to 90 CE, maybe a bit later. The virgin birth is expanded upon. There's this whole thing of an angel, all this, and there isn't as much of him telling people to keep his miracles a secret. When he dies on the cross, it's not as painful. Instead of saying, my God, you've forsaken me," he says, "Lord, into your hands I commend my spirit." And then with the resurrection, he actually walks. He spends 40 days here. That's actually in the sequel to the Gospel of Luke, the Book of Acts, but it was written by the same author. Possibly a year later, they might have been intended to be written together, but he stays for 40 days, and then after 40 days he ascends up to heaven, and then tongues of fire. Then there's the whole Pentecost. The Spirit kind of enters his disciples, and so we have that. Now let's get to the Gospel of John. There isn't anything about a virgin birth. There's possibly a verse that might possibly be implying that there was never a virgin birth. But basically it begins with this sort of poetry about how through him all things were made. And then, in the Gospel of John, he's basically running around announcing his divinity. And the crucifixion narrative, he's in full control. It ends where he says, "It is finished." And the resurrection happens again. He's walking. Someone even touches him. And then the ascension and Pentecost, tongues of fire return. And that's the Gospel of John. But I'm going to point out that even in the Gospel of John, Jesus is praying to a God higher than himself. And when he performs miracles, he still is talking about, like, something beyond himself. So, and this might be the ultimate, this is, scripturally speaking, this is sort of the ultimate evolution, but it was later when people started to interpret things, to reinterpret their ideas, where they added that he was fully God, or he was an equal to God. But in the Gospels, even when we get to, like, the highest divinity claims, he is still pointing beyond himself. And yeah, I haven't, there's a book that I haven't yet read by Bart Ehrman called How Jesus Became God. And I haven't read it as of the making of this video. I do hope to eventually get a chance to read it. But some books that I have read that talk about this are Liberating the Gospels, Reading the Bible Through Jewish Eyes by John Shelby Spong, Evolution of the Word by Marcus Borg, The Power of Parable by John Dominic Crossan. And yeah, I think those are some good books I highly recommend. And yeah, John Shelby Spong also talks about it in some of his other books, Why Christianity Must Change or Die, and A New Christianity for a New World. But yeah, so, but how, this is sort of, in some ways it's the evolution of his story, but in some ways it's the de-evolution, because we're losing touch with many things about him. I mean, the Gospels, yes, beautiful symbolic narratives, but yeah, I think something beautiful kind of became lost when he basically became elevated by people. Thank you for watching. Shalom.